My regular viewers know that I'm a cat parent, but today we're doing something for the dogs.
I love dogs. I've always loved dogs.
Hi, I'm Leigh Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to be doing a quick review of the new Leigh Whannell film, Wolfman, which is a reboot of the 1941 film The Wolfman, not to be confused with The Wolfman, a 2010 remake of the 1941 film. Being that this is a more well-known story, it's one of the classic Universal monsters, I'm not going to tiptoe around spoilers as much as I normally would during an opening weekend review. If all you want to know is my star rating and you don't already know that because you don't follow me on Letterboxd, I ended up logging this new film at 3 stars out of 5. For this review, I'll do a brief introduction of the Wolfman across these different versions, then a minimal spoilers section, and finish things off with a spoiler section. The Wolfman in all 3 of these versions refers to a man who unexpectedly survives an encounter with a werewolf, but is injured in such a way that he himself begins to transform into a werewolf, and consequently must grapple with this horrific new reality until he eventually meets his demise. Roll credits. The original film starred Lon Chaney Jr., who was the son of Lon Chaney, whom you might recognize as the Phantom of the Opera, because once you see this face, it's more or less impossible to forget. Lon Chaney Jr. played Lawrence Talbot, although he went by the name Larry in that film. The 2010 remake starred Benicio del Toro as Lawrence Talbot, and now in the 2025 version, we have Christopher Abbott playing a man named Blake Lovell, who is the one to transform into a werewolf, or a wolf man. In general, I find that these 3 films, despite their conceptual similarities, all offer something different, and thus I can easily understand why any viewer might feel inclined to rank these 3 films in any order, if ranking films is something you feel inclined to do. For me, the appeal of the 1941 film comes from many of the same things I love about any number of older classic films. The overall look of the film, I feel a comforting nostalgia for old-timey transatlantic line delivery, the style of scoring that you hear in older films, and so on and so forth. But as is often the case with older films, certain elements of the story and characterizations are very much a product of their time. For example, Larry Talbot is a lecherous creep, and that's how he is before he's transformed into a werewolf. I also don't entirely love the way Romani people are spoken about and characterized in that film. The 2010 film is an interesting case for me because although it seems like the popular opinion to dislike it, and there are definitely some VFX that perhaps haven't held up as well, Benicio del Toro is my bias. He is so compelling to watch that if you force me to choose just one, I will choose the 2010 film just to watch him grapple with his hairy predicament. And not only that, the 2010 Wolfman is a high-budget period piece, and with that you get to experience the elevated elegance of money well spent on locations and costumes that transport you back in time. The setting also makes the story feel like more of a classic. It feels like a piece of centuries-old literature being adapted for the big screen with a $150 million budget, and if that weren't enough, Benicio del Toro's father is played by Anthony Hopkins. All the family drama and emotional baggage in that relationship is perfectly played, so that automatically makes the story come across as more Shakespearean. And then we have the new 2025 film, so now we might as well segue into the minimal spoilers section of this review. A key piece of context for my judgment of Wolfman is the fact that this is a Leigh Whannell film. I actually don't feel as strongly about whether or not this new film holds up or is as good as the other 2 Wolfman films. And yes, I know that Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman appeared in other Universal films, but for the sake of keeping things somewhat concise, I've only done cross comparisons for the 3 versions that are focusing on that titular character. What ultimately impacted my judgment of this new Wolfman film more than anything else was the fact that previously Leigh Whannell had done another modern reimagining of a Universal monster story. That was his 2020 film, The Invisible Man. Leigh Whannell's Invisible Man was excellent. We had this really compelling story about domestic violence, and on top of that, really well-designed action and scares. Whether you were there to watch the spooky things, or you wanted something more meaningful to give the narrative depth and gravitas, or you wanted a bit of both, you could watch that film and be satisfied by the overall quality. As such, I had high expectations for Leigh Whannell specifically to be the one to do another modern reimagining of a classic Universal monster concept. Now, with this new version of Wolfman, we get a considerable amount of screen time to set up the protagonist past, explain his origins, where he currently is in his adult life with his relationships and his loved ones, and then once we hit the midway point of the runtime, that's when the werewolf action really kicks off in a major way, and the entirety of what happens from that point onward takes place within a single night. The problem I have with this is that so much work has been put into trying to explain the deeper layers of the core group of characters and their relationships with one another that if you really wanted to do those relationships and character arcs justice, you needed more time within the narrative to follow those things and how they evolve or are fleshed out because of the werewolf attack and consequent transformation. Anyone even mildly familiar with the Wolfman premise or werewolf stories knows that once you get your scratch or bite from the werewolf, you are now going to be the next one to transform into a werewolf. It's not unheard of to time this in such a way that you build up to their first real transformation over the course of days or weeks. All the while, that narrative will also be intertwined with some sort of emotional, dramatic arc. This new Wolfman film has very little room to breathe. All of the dimensions and layers you want to explore are squashed down in the second half in favor of focusing on building up the horror and tension of a man transforming into a monster. Now, on a more positive note, Leigh Whannell's Wolfman achieves its werewolf horror through the use of practical effects, and I'm always inclined to give points for taking the time and effort to build monsters and monstrous effects through the use of practical work, prosthetics, makeup, and of course having your lead actor emote in all the necessary ways to achieve the proper emotional impact from what is happening. There are some really clever storytelling choices of how to communicate the shift in Blake's perspective the more that he begins to transform. There is no denying that Leigh Whannell has a lot of skills and experience in the horror genre, and many of those abilities are evident in the better parts of this new Wolfman film. If this film had been released exactly as it exists, but it had been made by a filmmaker who was having their debut in directing a feature film, I would have been far more impressed and favorable in my feedback, but because this is Leigh Whannell, who has decades of experience in the horror genre, he co-created the Saw franchise alongside James Wan, among other things. The first Saw film came out over 20 years ago. With such formidable success and career highs within the horror genre, I am going to expect more than what this film ultimately presented. But now let's go through more of the specifics with a spoiler section. Leigh Whannell's Wolfman opens on a young boy with an overbearing, almost cruel father. They eventually hint that there's some sort of secret society or group of people that the father is a part of, and this group is aware of werewolves and the threat that they pose. As such, the reason for his overly tough parenting style is that he's trying to prepare his young son for the danger of werewolves. That being said, you don't know what sort of organization is working towards fighting or even just surviving against these werewolf creatures. It's only a whisper of a detail that is intended to try to make Blake's father more nuanced and sympathetic of a character. That feels like a waste of time, particularly when this film doesn't even hit a full 2 hours in its runtime, and it continues to lag as it over-explains the specific dynamics between Blake and his wife Charlotte, Blake and his daughter Ginger, and Charlotte's relationship with Ginger as well. Basically, Blake and Charlotte's marriage isn't as happy as it used to be. Blake and Ginger get along very well, and he's very much the favorite parent, though some of that is understandable because he's currently a stay-at-home father. They also play around with the idea that he is much more self-conscious about any moments he has where he loses his temper, and how he wants to be a more emotionally sensitive father than his own father was to him. Charlotte is self-conscious about her ability to connect to Ginger. She feels like there's this distance between them, and when Blake receives the paperwork that has declared his father to be legally dead, he proposes to Charlotte that they will go with Ginger back to Blake's family home. They can spend the summer there, they will pack everything up and put his father's affairs in order, and also be able to use that time to reconnect as a family. Charlotte works as a journalist, so the idea is that she can work remotely, or she can take some time off, or some sort of hybrid setup. They don't overly elaborate on those details. But when they are trying to find their way to Blake's family home, they come across a local, Derek, who remembers Blake because the two of them both grew up there. Derek gets in their truck in order to help direct them where they need to go, but while they're driving through the woods, Blake spots a man, a wolf man, on the road, and the surprise of this causes him to abruptly swerve the truck, and it causes the crash which you can see the aftermath of in the film's trailer. The wolf man scratches Blake on the arm before Blake is able to get his wife and daughter back to the family home that he grew up in. Over the course of this one night. You see Blake transform into a Wolfman. The family fails when they attempt to escape. Blake fights off and eventually kills the Wolfman that turned him, whom he is horrified to discover was in fact his own father. That's why he had disappeared for all of that time. And finally, as Blake becomes increasingly overcome by the Wolfman bloodthirst, his daughter is able to read his mind. This is not in a supernatural sense, but it's a thing they establish early on in the film where the two of them have a very close relationship, and as such she is able to read his mind simply by knowing him very well and having a good read on the situation of that particular moment and how he appears to be expressing himself emotionally, even if he isn't saying what he's feeling verbally. So Ginger reads her father's mind and tells Charlotte that Blake is ready for this to be over, so Charlotte takes him out. Dirt nap for Blake. Because all of this is happening in one night, there is no time given to let the audience or the characters sit and process the ongoing development and revelations of Blake's transformation, the widening chasm between him and his family, not to mention the admittedly predictable revelation of his father being the one to change him. Everything is being driven by the rapid transformation into a Wolfman in the second half of the film. This family was supposed to spend the summer at this family home. If you had used more of that time to do that, you would give the story and characters room to breathe and fully flesh out the descent and regression in both a physical and psychological sense that Blake would have in being back at this family home. At the most superficial level, you have a man transforming into a monster, but you spent half the runtime drilling it into the audience that this story is an allegory for the cycle of abuse, which, by the way, the 2010 Wolfman also did, but they didn't speed run through that concept in a single night. This 2025 narrative would have been able to better execute its intended concept if Blake had to spend time at the house and have all of these old memories resurface, which would impact his general mood and temperament, and of course all of that would be heightened by him also having been infected by werewolf sickness. Similar to Leigh Whannell's Invisible Man, you would have been able to tell your story on multiple levels. You would have the monster body horror of a man turning into a werewolf, but beyond that we would also have a dramatic narrative about a man struggling to try to break the cycle of abuse he grew up in. You had Blake telling his wife that he wants to enjoy his time with the only remaining family he has. Why are you speed running through werewolf horror in a single night? It's downright baffling of a choice the more that I think about it. Now I feel like I've made my point several times over, so I would like to wrap up this review by touching on a couple of the technical details that I really liked about this new Wolfman. For starters, the physical appearance of this version of Wolfman felt like something new and more grotesque. They were not pleasant creatures to look at, and I do mean that as a compliment because you put your own spin and interpretation on this creature, and I do think that there is room for many different types of werewolves. You've got werewolves like the ones we saw in the 1941 and 2010 film. You've got werewolves that more or less look exactly like regular wolves, except perhaps they're oversized, and now we also have these creepy looking things in Wolfman 2025. A lot of the technical filmmaking choices to communicate Blake's transformation were also really fun to watch. One of them being when he realized he could hear a spider crawling on the wall at a very loud volume, and the camera starts swaying to show how shaken he is at this discovery of his changing. I loved watching that. And the part where his arm wound that Charlotte had wrapped up is revealed again, and instead of healing, it's bleeding, the wound is worse, and Blake proceeds to start chomping on his own arm. That was so foul and twisted, and I loved it. And I almost bumped my rating up for that reason alone, were it not for the fact that the more the film went on, the more frustrated I became over how rushed things felt and how much was left unexplored because of the choice to have all of this happening in just one night. In a similar vein though, having him chew off his own foot to get out of a bear trap, that was so unhinged, and I will give it a stamp of approval. The transition in and out of Blake's perspective, where you are able to see how his vision of his family becomes increasingly distorted and he struggles to understand the English language the more that he begins to transform, that was such an interesting way to present his rapidly escalating transformation. It reminded me a bit of the linguistic transition we saw in Duncan Jones's Warcraft film. The action of Wolfman was simple but mostly effective. The fight between Blake and his father was especially gripping and visceral, but it came about so abruptly, paired with the reveal of whomst he was fighting, and there just wasn't enough time to process that. If we had done the attack the first first night they arrived. And then you gave them a month for the family to work through some of their relationship issues. You have the building tension and countdown to another full moon, and these childhood memories are resurfacing because he's in his family home. That would have been a much more preferable journey towards his tragic demise of choosing to end the cycle and sacrificing himself so that he doesn't do any damage to his family the way that his father did to him. Now, overall, it was by no means a bad film, but I believe that Leigh Whannell is capable of far more. So whatever his next feature film ends up being, in all likelihood, I will still be interested in watching it.